On that morning of August 25th, 1944, somewhere near Saint-Lô in the French countryside, a German intelligence officer from the Wehrmacht stood with his field glasses pressed to his face, watching something that defied everything he thought he understood about modern warfare. Across the horizon, as far as he could see in either direction, American trucks moved in an unbroken stream toward the east, thundering through the devastated Norman landscape. That evening, he would record his observations in his leather field journal, writing words so pessimistic they could have gotten him court-martialed if discovered. The entry read that this couldn't possibly be real, that no military force could maintain mechanized operations at such distances from their ports using only trucks, that their own doctrine proved such a thing was impossible. Yet there the Americans were in endless columns, moving with greater speed than German trains could ever achieve. What this officer witnessed was the inaugural day of full operations for what would come to be called the Red Ball Express, an emergency supply system born from a frantic 36-hour meeting between Colonel Lorraine Albert Ayres and Major Gordon K. Gravel. This system would proceed to demolish every assumption German military doctrine maintained about logistics in modern warfare. The mathematical reality of what was beginning would damage Wehrmacht morale more severely than many battlefield defeats. Within just 4 days, nearly 6,000 vehicles would deliver 12,500 tons of supplies each day across 400 miles of war-damaged French territory, sustaining an advance that German staff officers had calculated with certainty to be logistically impossible. The story had started 3 weeks before, when General George S. Patton's Third Army broke out from the Normandy hedgerows following Operation Cobra on July 25, 1944. German commanders initially refused to believe reports describing American armoured columns advancing 60 to 80 miles weekly. General Oberst Otto von Knobelsdorff, in command of the German First Army, informed his staff on August 15th that the American supply lines surely must have collapsed already. He stated that no force could maintain such operational tempo beyond 100 kilometers from their supply base, that their own experience proved this absolutely, that the Americans would halt within days, starved of fuel and ammunition, and all they needed to do was wait. The confidence of the German General Staff rested upon decades of accumulated military science. Wehrmacht doctrine, refined through campaigns across Poland, France and Russia, stated categorically that motorized divisions required railway support for any advance exceeding 150 kilometers. Their entire military structure depended upon this iron law of logistics. Each German division operating in France still employed nearly 5,000 horses alongside their vehicles. The famous panzer divisions that had shocked the world in 1940 never operated more than 200 kilometers from functioning railheads. Their supply system remained essentially unchanged from the First World War, dependent upon railways vulnerable to bombing, horses requiring fodder, and vehicles needing dozens of different spare parts. German staff officers had written extensively about how American forces would face the same constraints limiting every modern army. They reasoned that Americans might have more trucks, but trucks could never replace railways for strategic movement, that the fuel consumption alone made it impossible, that a truck carrying fuel consumes fuel to deliver fuel, making the mathematics inescapable. They believed Americans would culminate within days of outrunning their rail support. This analysis had proven correct in every campaign since 1914. There existed no reason to believe this time would be different. But what the Americans were about to demonstrate was something the German military mind couldn't grasp. They weren't simply going to stretch their logistics, they were going to completely reinvent them. What the Germans failed to understand was that American industrial capacity had reached levels making their careful calculations obsolete. Where German logisticians thought in terms of scarcity and efficiency, Americans thought in terms of abundance and overwhelming force. Private James Ruckard, 19 years old, from Maple Heights, Ohio, climbed into his GMC CCKW cargo truck cab at 4 in the morning on August 25th. Before his draft, he had never driven anything larger than his uncle's pickup. Now he belonged to the 3,846th Quartermaster Truck Company. one of 67 companies initially assigned to an operation so urgent it hadn't even received a proper name yet. The briefing had been simple but urgent. Drive like hell, deliver your cargo, and get back for another load. Don't stop for anything. The lieutenant had looked them straight in the eye when adding that last part, saying that when he said anything, he meant anything. If your truck breaks down, you hitch a ride with another. If you see Germans, you keep driving. We stop for nothing. What Ruckard and 23,000 other drivers didn't fully understand was that they were about to prove every German calculation about logistics wrong. They were about to demonstrate that with enough trucks, enough fuel, and enough determination, an army could advance faster and farther than military science said was possible. Brigadier General Ewart G. Planck, implementing the convoy system, made a declaration that would echo through military history, stating that it should never be said that a lack of supplies stopped Patton when the Germans couldn't. The scope of what the Americans were attempting defied German comprehension. The Wehrmacht, even at its peak efficiency during the 1940 invasion of France, had never managed to sustain more than 300 trucks operating continuously on a single supply route. The Americans were about to put 6,000 vehicles into non-stop operation, running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Wehrmacht intelligence officers, observing from concealed positions near Chartres, counted 140 trucks passing in a single hour. When these numbers were reported to division commanders, they were dismissed as exaggerations or alcohol-induced hallucinations. No army possessed that many trucks. It was impossible. German observers watching from hidden positions counted until they ran out of numbers. When they reported this to division commanders, they were accused of exaggerating or drinking. Division commanders insisted it was impossible, telling them to check their numbers again, stating that no army had that many trucks, that the entire Wehrmacht didn't have that many trucks in operational condition. But the counts were accurate, and they represented less than 3% of the Red Bull fleet. The Americans had done something the Germans considered impossible. They had completely motorized their supply system, eliminating railways from the equation entirely. While German quartermasters still calculated supply requirements in terms of hay for horses and coal for locomotives, American planners thought in terms of tons of hay for horses and tons of coal for locomotives, terms of octane ratings and tire wear. The contrast was not just quantitative but qualitative, representing two entirely different concepts of warfare. The trucks themselves were a revelation to German observers. The GMC CCKW Deuce and a Half and the Dodge WC series vehicles were not individually superior to German trucks. The Opel Blitz, when the Wehrmacht could get them, were arguably more sophisticated. But the Americans had standardized their fleet to a degree that stunned German mechanics who examined captured vehicles. Every single truck used interchangeable parts. In Wehrmacht motorpools, there were 12 different types of vehicles requiring 47 different categories of spare parts. The Americans had essentially one type requiring one set of spares. The implications for maintenance and repair were staggering. The standardization went beyond just the trucks. The Americans had standardized everything: fuel cans, tires, tools, even the driver training. A driver who had learned on one truck could immediately operate any other. A mechanic who could fix one could fix them all. Spare parts from one truck could keep 5 others running. It was mass production applied to military logistics, and it was devastating in its effectiveness. The speed of the operation shattered German tactical planning. Wehrmacht doctrine assumed that Allied forces, like their own, would need to pause every 150 to 200 kilometers to consolidate supply lines and establish new depots. This would give defending forces time to reorganize and establish new defensive lines. But the Americans never stopped. The trucks kept coming, and their tanks kept moving. It was as if the normal laws of military physics didn't apply to them. The Red Ball Express drivers themselves became unwitting psychological weapons against German morale. 75% of them were African-American soldiers, men whom Nazi racial ideology deemed inferior and incapable of technical tasks. German soldiers captured in September 1944 later testified about watching the convoys pass. They said they had been told the Americans would collapse because their mongrel army included Negroes who couldn't master machinery, yet here were thousands of them, driving complex vehicles in perfect convoy formation, maintaining speeds they couldn't achieve with their best drivers. Everything they had been told was a lie. The sight of black soldiers operating sophisticated equipment with skill and precision created cognitive dissonance among German troops. Nazi ideology held that racial mixing weakened armies, that only racially pure forces could achieve military excellence. Yet here was evidence that contradicted everything they had been taught. The psychological impact was profound. If the racial theories were wrong, what else had been a lie? Corporal Charles H. Johnson of the 783 Military Police Battalion stood at a critical crossroads, directing the endless stream of trucks. In 12 hours, he would wave through more vehicles than most German cities saw in a month. The MPs had painted signs with a simple symbol, a red ball on a white background. No other vehicles were permitted on these designated routes. French civilians were turned back. Even general officers in staff cars had to find alternate routes. The road belonged to the Red Ball Express, and nothing was allowed to slow it down. The organizational precision amazed German observers. Every truck was numbered. Every driver had specific instructions. Loading points, unloading points, refueling stops, maintenance areas, all precisely coordinated. It was American industrial management applied to warfare, and it worked with an efficiency that German staff officers could only dream of achieving. The psychological impact on German intelligence was devastating. Wehrmacht analysts studying the American logistics network for Army Group B submitted reports on September 2nd that bordered on panic. Their supply system operates at impossible levels, they wrote. They are delivering 12,000 tons daily using only trucks. This exceeds the capacity of most rail networks. If these figures are accurate, and field observations confirm they are, then we have fundamentally misunderstood American industrial capacity. The numbers cited were not only accurate but conservative. On August 29th, the Red Ball Express achieved its peak single-day delivery of 12,342 tons of supplies, carried by 5,958 vehicles. To put this in perspective, the entire German Army Group B, defending against the Allied advance, received less than 2,000 tons of supplies daily through their combined rail and road network. The disparity was not just significant, it was overwhelming. General der Panzertruppe Heinrich Eberbach, commanding Panzer Group West, wrote in his diary before his capture in late August that they were fighting an enemy who seemed to have unlimited everything: unlimited trucks, unlimited fuel, unlimited ability to sustain operations. He asked how one could develop tactics against an enemy who ignores the constraints that bind every other army. They make plans based on when the Americans should run out of supplies, but they never do. It's like fighting the ocean. The German confusion deepened as they observed American refueling operations. Wehrmacht trucks, when they had fuel at all, were refueled by hand pumps from 200-litre drums, a process that could take an hour for a single company. Staff Sergeant William Edwards of the 3639 Quartermaster Truck Company described their method in a post-war interview. They'd pull into a fuel dump, 20 or 30 trucks at a time. They had these pumps, just like at a filling station back home, except bigger. 5 minutes, and you were gassed up and rolling again. The Germans watching must have thought they were performing magic. It wasn't magic. It was industrial standardization on a scale the Germans had never achieved. The Americans were using purpose-built fuel trucks with power takeoff pumps that could deliver 50 gallons per minute. The Germans were still using modified civilian fuel trucks that managed perhaps 10 gallons per minute when the hand pumps worked properly. German observers reported to their commanders that the Americans refueled a company of trucks faster than they could refuel a platoon, that the efficiency was industrial, not military, that they had turned warfare into factory work. The German High Command's response revealed their complete inability to comprehend what they were facing. On September 5th, Field Marshal Walter Model issued an order to all units stating that reports of American truck convoys exceeding 1,000 vehicles daily were obvious exaggerations and should be disregarded as enemy propaganda. Units spreading such defeatist rumors would face severe discipline. But Model's own staff knew the truth. His logistics officer had personally observed the convoys and wrote privately that Model refused to believe what they all could see with their own eyes. The Americans have made our entire concept of warfare obsolete. They don't capture territory and then consolidate. They capture territory and keep moving because their supplies never stop flowing. The maintenance system supporting the Red Ball Express provided another shock to German observers. Captain Otto Skorzeny, Hitler's commando specialist, had been tasked with disrupting American supply lines. His reconnaissance revealed something that stunned him. Every 50 miles they have maintenance stations, not depots, not major facilities, just mechanics with parts and tools. A truck breaks down, they fix it on the spot or push it aside, and the driver jumps on another truck. In our army, a broken vehicle means a lost cargo delivery. In theirs, only the truck is lost, never the cargo or the driver. The Americans had positioned 300 maintenance trucks along the Red Ball routes, each capable of performing major repairs. They carried welding equipment, machine tools, and mountains of spare parts. Private First Class Robert Williams, an African-American mechanic with the 894th Ordnance Company, recalled the intensity of the work. They'd have trucks rolling in with blown engines, shattered transmissions, axles bent from overloading. In the States, these would be depot-level repairs taking weeks. They were fixing them in hours, sometimes right there on the roadside. If they couldn't fix it in 30 minutes, they'd drag it off the road and cannibalize it for parts. The Germans, in contrast, were still sending damaged vehicles back to factory facilities in Germany for major repairs. A damaged half-track might spend 3 weeks in transit and repair. The Americans were putting vehicles back in service in 3 hours. Major Rudolf Lehmann of the 12th SS Panzer Division wrote in frustration that they destroy 10 American trucks in an ambush, and within 2 hours the cargo has been transferred to new vehicles and is moving again. The drivers they capture are new men they've never seen before. They seem to have unlimited reserves of both men and machines. The human dimension of the Red Ball Express delivered perhaps the most devastating blow to Nazi ideology. Here were African-American soldiers, men whom Nazi racial theory classified as Untermensch, incapable of operating complex machinery, maintaining the most sophisticated logistics operation in military history. Technical Sergeant Edward Sheffield of the 514th Quartermaster Truck Regiment had been a sharecropper's son from Alabama. Now he commanded a platoon of 40 trucks, coordinating their movements with the precision of a symphony conductor. They knew what they were doing mattered, he recalled in a 1995 interview. Every gallon of gas they delivered meant Patton's tanks could move another mile toward Berlin. Every box of ammunition meant their boys could keep fighting. They weren't just driving trucks, they were winning the war. By September 10th, Patton's Third Army had advanced 400 miles from the Normandy beaches. German doctrine stated categorically that such an advance was impossible without rail support. The furthest the Wehrmacht had ever sustained an offensive from fixed supply bases was 300 miles during the invasion of France in 1940, and that had required capturing French fuel depots. The Americans were doing it with trucks alone, carrying everything they needed from the beaches. General Hermann Balck, commanding German Army Group G, held an emergency meeting with his staff on September 12th. His operations officer, Oberst Friedrich von Mellenthin, recorded the discussion in detail. Balck demanded to know how the Americans were sustaining their advance. When told about the truck convoys, he exploded in rage, calling it impossible. No army can consume 800,000 gallons of fuel daily and transport it 400 miles by truck. The fuel needed to move the fuel would consume the entire capacity. It's a mathematical impossibility. Yet the impossible was happening. The Americans were not just maintaining Patton's advance, they were accelerating it. The secret lay in something the Germans never fully grasped: industrial-scale efficiency. Every aspect of the Red Ball Express had been optimized. The routes were one-way, eliminating the delays of two-way traffic. Trucks ran with their governors removed, reaching speeds of 60 miles per hour instead of the regulation 35. MPs were stationed every few miles to push broken-down vehicles off the road immediately, preventing traffic jams. Loading and unloading was done by special teams who could clear a truck in 15 minutes instead of an hour. Master Sergeant John Bass of the 582 Quartermaster Company described the loading process. They had it down to a science. Truck pulls up, doesn't even shut off the engine. One team's already positioned with forklifts, another with hand trucks. 15 minutes maximum, usually 10, and that truck was rolling again. The Germans were still unloading by hand, one box at a time. They were moving entire pallets. The palletization system alone revolutionized military logistics. The Germans still loaded individual boxes, barrels, and containers, each requiring separate handling. The Americans had standardized wooden pallets that could be loaded with a forklift in seconds. German officers studying captured American supply dumps wrote in amazement that one American soldier with a forklift moves more cargo in an hour than a company of their men can move by hand in a day. This is not superior soldiering, they wrote, it is superior systems. The convoy system operated with relentless efficiency. Trucks were numbered and tracked. If truck 342 left Cherbourg at 8 in the morning with 2.5 tons of ammunition, logistics officers knew exactly when it should arrive at Chartres. If it didn't appear, MP patrols would search for it immediately. The Germans, observing this precision, couldn't understand how it was coordinated without massive bureaucracy. They manage thousands of vehicles with less paperwork than we require for a company, they noted. Their efficiency seems impossible, yet we see it working every hour of every day. The fuel consumption that German planners insisted would stop the American advance never materialized as a constraint. The Americans had solved the equation through sheer volume. Yes, the trucks consumed enormous quantities of fuel to move fuel, but they simply provided more trucks and more fuel. When German calculations showed the Americans would need 500 trucks to maintain operations, the Americans provided 5,000. Major General Otto Heidkemper, Chief of Staff for German Army Group B, admitted after the war that they kept calculating when the Americans would culminate, when the weight of their logistics would force them to stop. They never understood the Americans had the industrial capacity to simply overwhelm the problem with resources. Where they would husband every litre of fuel, the Americans would simply provide another 1,000 trucks carrying more fuel. The German attempt to interdict the Red Ball Express revealed the full extent of their miscalculation. The Luftwaffe, reduced to a shadow of its former strength, could barely manage 100 sorties per day over France. When they did attack the convoys, the results were minimal. The columns were so long that destroying even a dozen trucks barely affected operations. Oberleutnant Heinrich Hartmann, flying one of the few remaining Focke-Wulf 190s, described attacking a Red Ball convoy. He made 3 strafing passes, destroyed perhaps 5 trucks. As he climbed away, he could see hundreds more still moving. It was like attacking an anthill with a pin. No matter how many you destroyed, more kept coming. The Americans had anticipated air attacks and planned accordingly. Trucks maintained 60-yard intervals, limiting the damage any single attack could cause. Quad 50 caliber anti-aircraft guns were stationed along the routes. Most importantly, the sheer redundancy of the system meant that losses were immediately absorbed. Captain Frank Percival of the 146th Quartermaster Truck Company remembered the attacks as more annoyance than threat. Sure, they'd hit some trucks, but they had so many running that it didn't matter. They'd push the burning wrecks off the road and keep moving. The cargo from destroyed trucks would be on other trucks within an hour. By mid-September, the Red Ball Express had transported over 200,000 tons of supplies. German Army Group B had received less than 30,000 tons in the same period through their entire logistics network. The disparity was so enormous that German commanders began refusing to believe their own intelligence reports. General von Zangen, commanding the 15th Army, accused his intelligence officer of defeatism when presented with estimates of American supply capacity. "These numbers cannot be real," he insisted. "You're telling me they move in one day what we move in a week? Either your sources are wrong or you've been listening to enemy propaganda." But the evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. German units were capturing American supply dumps that contained more material than entire German divisions possessed. A German officer described when his regiment overran a small American fuel depot and found 10,000 gallons of gasoline casually stored in a field. This was a minor depot, one they hadn't even properly defended. Yet it contained more fuel than their entire regiment had seen in 6 months. They burned what they couldn't carry, but he knew then that they were fighting an enemy whose resources were effectively infinite. The psychological impact extended beyond just material superiority. The Red Ball Express demonstrated American organizational capability that contradicted Nazi propaganda about democratic weakness. German prisoners captured in September 1944 told their interrogators that they were taught democracy made people soft and disorganized, that only authoritarian discipline could achieve military efficiency. But the American supply system functioned with a precision that exceeded anything in the Wehrmacht. Soldiers seemed to know their jobs without being screamed at by officers. They worked with purpose rather than fear. The drivers themselves became legends among both American and German forces. They drove for 54 hours straight, catching brief naps while their co-drivers took the wheel. They navigated bomb-cratered roads in blackout conditions, their only illumination the cat-eye blackout lights that provided barely enough light to see the road. They pushed their trucks beyond all mechanical limits, running engines until they seized, then jumping onto another truck to continue the mission. Private Eugene Dixon of the 3916 Quartermaster Truck Company remembered the exhaustion. There were times he was so tired he was hallucinating, seeing things that weren't there, but they kept driving. They knew boys were dying up front, waiting for what they carried. Sleep could wait. The Germans, observing this dedication, couldn't reconcile it with their ideological beliefs. SS Sturmbannführer Joachim Peiper, whose unit would later perpetrate the Malmedy massacre during the Battle of the Bulge, wrote in a September 1944 report that the Negro drivers display a commitment that contradicts their racial theories. They drive with skill and courage, maintaining their vehicles with expertise. The implications for their ideology are profound but cannot be openly discussed. The maintenance statistics alone told a story that stunned German quartermasters. Despite running vehicles 20 hours per day at speeds that should have destroyed them, the Americans maintained an 85% operational readiness rate. German units babying their precious vehicles rarely exceeded 60% readiness. The secret lay in preventive maintenance and standardization. Every Red Ball truck received a 10-point check every time it stopped. Oil, water, tyre pressure, brake fluid all checked and topped off in minutes. German mechanics examining captured Red Ball trucks were amazed. These vehicles have been driven like racing cars for weeks, yet they're in better condition than our trucks that barely move. They must perform maintenance constantly, at a level we only do in depot facilities. The American drivers had developed their own culture and methods that maximized efficiency. They removed governors to increase speed, modified carburetors for better fuel flow, and reinforced suspensions with unauthorized field modifications. When officers tried to enforce regulations, the drivers simply ignored them. Colonel Charles Lanham, commanding elements of the Red Ball Express, admitted after the war that officially he was supposed to court-martial drivers for removing governors. Unofficially, he told his officers to look the other way. These men were winning the war 2.5 tons at a time. If they needed to break some rules to do it, so be it. The Germans tried desperately to understand and counter the Red Ball Express. Special commando units were tasked with mining the routes, but the sheer volume of traffic meant that even successful attacks barely slowed operations. A destroyed bridge would be replaced by engineers in hours, sometimes with prefabricated Bailey Bridge sections carried by the convoys themselves. Major Wolfgang Schenk, tasked with interdicting American supply lines, reported in frustration that they mine a road and the Americans clear it in 2 hours. They destroy a bridge and the Americans build another overnight. They ambush a convoy and 10 more pass while they're engaging. It's not fighting an army, it's fighting a force of nature. The Red Ball Express transformed more than just logistics. It revolutionized military thinking about what was possible. The German General Staff had spent decades perfecting the relationship between operations and logistics, calculating precise ratios of advance to supply. The Americans simply threw away the calculations and overwhelmed the problem with industrial might. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, admitted during his post-war interrogation that they thought in terms of efficiency, of doing more with less. The Americans thought in terms of abundance, of doing everything with more. Their best staff officers couldn't comprehend it because it violated everything they knew about military science. By late September 1944, the Red Ball Express had delivered over 300,000 tons of supplies. Patton's Third Army had advanced further and faster than any military force in history, covering 600 miles in 40 days. German commanders were no longer debating when the American advance would culminate. They were desperately trying to understand how it hadn't already. A German staff officer wrote that they face an enemy who has made their entire concept of warfare obsolete. They don't pause to consolidate because they never run out of supplies, because they never run out of fuel. They have turned logistics from a constraint into a weapon. The impact on German morale was catastrophic. Soldiers who had been told they were the master race, fighting with superior Aryan efficiency, watched as African-American drivers maintained a logistics miracle that the Wehrmacht could never duplicate. A captured German soldier asked, "If the Americans can train their Negroes to accomplish this, what does that say about everything we've been told? Are we the superior race, or have we simply been lied to about everything?" French civilians watched in amazement as the convoys thundered through their villages day and night. Marie Dubois, a schoolteacher in Dreux, kept a diary throughout the occupation and liberation. "The Germans came through with horses and wagons, taking days to pass," she wrote. "The Americans come with endless trucks, never stopping, never slowing. In 1 hour, more American trucks pass than German vehicles did in a month. The noise never stops, engines roaring day and night. It's the sound of liberation. The drivers faced constant danger beyond German attacks. The roads, already damaged by war, were being pulverized by the constant heavy traffic. Trucks overturned on destroyed shoulders. Drivers fell asleep at the wheel, crashing into ditches. The accident rate was significant, but the convoys never stopped." Private William Clark of the 3418 Quartermaster Truck Company survived 3 rollovers during his time with the Red Ball Express. The first time, he was scared to death. The third time, he just climbed out, grabbed his rifle, and flagged down the next truck. They all knew the deal. The supplies had to get through. Everything else was secondary. In October 1944, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt ordered a comprehensive study of American logistics capabilities. The report, completed just before the Battle of the Bulge, was a masterpiece of military analysis that reached a devastating conclusion. "The American logistics system operates at levels that our doctrine declares impossible," it stated. "They sustain operations at distances and speeds that exceed our theoretical maximum by factors of 3 or 4. We must conclude either that our entire understanding of military logistics is wrong, or that the Americans possess industrial and organizational capabilities beyond our comprehension. In either case, the implications for the war's outcome are clear." The report was classified and hidden from most German commanders, deemed too demoralizing to distribute, but those who read it understood its significance. The Americans hadn't just outproduced Germany. They had revolutionized warfare itself. Wars would no longer be won by the side with the best tactics or the bravest soldiers. but by the side that could deliver the most material to the point of contact. General Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the Wehrmacht High Command, wrote in his prison cell after the war that they understood combined arms, the integration of tanks and aircraft and infantry. What they never understood was that the Americans had added a fourth dimension, logistics as a weapon system itself. The Red Ball Express was not supporting the war. It was the war. The statistics, when finally compiled after the war, were staggering. In 83 days of operation, the Red Ball Express delivered 412,193 tons of supplies. The trucks travelled over 122 million ton miles. Over 40,000 tyres were worn out. The operation consumed 300,000 gallons of oil and 40 million gallons of gasoline. At its peak, a truck passed any given point on the route every 14 seconds, 24 hours a day. German staff officers studying these numbers after the war simply couldn't reconcile them with their experience. General Major Friedrich von Mellenthin wrote in his memoir that the Red Ball Express moved more tonnage than most national railway systems. They did it with trucks, over demolished roads, under combat conditions. It remains the most impressive logistics achievement in military history. The human cost was significant, but far less than conventional military operations. Approximately 300 drivers died during Red Ball Express operations, mostly from accidents and exhaustion-related crashes. German attempts to interdict the convoys resulted in fewer than 50 combat deaths. The Germans lost more men trying to stop the convoys than the Americans lost running them. Major Heinrich Böll, who would later become a Nobel Prize-winning author, observed the Red Ball Express as a Wehrmacht artillery observer. They could have killed more of them, certainly. But what would have been the point? For every truck they destroyed, 10 more appeared. For every driver they killed, 10 more replaced him. They had replacements. They were trying to stop a river with their bare hands. The Red Ball Express officially ended on November 16, 1944, as the port of Antwerp opened and railway lines were restored. But its impact had already transformed the war. The German Ardennes offensive in December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge, was premised entirely on capturing American fuel depots because the Germans knew they could never match American logistics capabilities. The offensive's failure was partly due to the Red Ball Express, which had pre-positioned so many supplies that American forces could respond immediately despite the surprise attack. SS Obersturmbannführer Jochen Peiper, leading the spearhead of the German offensive, had been promised captured American fuel depots to sustain his advance. When his units overran a depot near Stavelot, they found it already destroyed by retreating Americans. In his interrogation after capture, Peiper said bitterly that the Americans could afford to burn more fuel than they could capture. The depot they needed contained 2.5 million gallons. The Americans destroyed it rather than let them have it. Only a nation with unlimited resources could make such a decision. The Red Ball Express drivers returned to their regular units or were reassigned to other supply operations. Many would continue driving trucks through the end of the war, sustaining the Allied advance into Germany. They received little recognition at the time. The segregated army meant that African American soldiers, regardless of their contributions, were relegated to second-class status. It would be decades before their achievement was properly acknowledged. But the German military professionals knew what had happened. General Franz Halder, former chief of the German General Staff, wrote in his post-war analysis that the Red Ball Express proved that in modern war, logistics is not just a support function, but a decisive weapon. The Americans understood this. They didn't. They were still fighting the last war, depending on railways and horses. The Americans were fighting the next war, where industrial capacity and organizational efficiency would determine victory. Technical Sergeant James Bailey, an African-American driver with the 3628 Quartermaster Truck Company, reflected years later on what they had accomplished. They told them they were just truck drivers, not real soldiers, but they knew better. Every mile they drove, every ton they delivered, brought the war closer to ending. They weren't shooting at Germans, but they were beating them just the same. The Germans had the best trained army in the world, but they had something better. They had Detroit putting out trucks faster than the Germans could count, oil fields in Texas pumping out unlimited fuel, and boys from Alabama and Mississippi who could drive anything with wheels through any conditions. The Germans never had a chance. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, one of Germany's most capable commanders, admitted after the war what the Red Ball Express had demonstrated. Germans prided themselves on military efficiency, on doing more with less. The Americans showed them that in modern industrial war, the side that can do more with more will always win. They had better soldiers, perhaps better generals. But the Americans had unlimited trucks, unlimited fuel, unlimited everything. How do you defeat an enemy that can lose 100 trucks and not even notice? General Oberst Heinz Guderian, the father of German armoured warfare, who had created the Blitzkrieg concept that revolutionised warfare in 1939 and 1940, provided perhaps the most telling assessment in his post-war memoirs. They invented fast-moving armoured warfare, but the Americans perfected it. They could advance 200 kilometres and then had to stop for supplies. The Americans advanced 600 kilometres and never stopped. The difference was not in their tanks or American tanks. The difference was that behind every American tank were 100 trucks bringing fuel, ammunition, and food. They never understood that in modern war, the truck is more important than the tank. The secret army that had fueled Patton's Blitz was not secret at all. It was 23,000 American drivers, mostly African Americans, who drove through exhaustion, enemy fire, and impossible conditions to deliver 412,193 tons of supplies across 400 miles of war-torn France. They had turned logistics from a science of limitations into an art of possibilities. In 83 days, the Red Ball Express had proven that in modern warfare, the nation with the most trucks and the determination to keep them rolling would inevitably prevail. German military doctrine that had conquered most of Europe between 1939 and 1941 had rested on careful calculations of what was logistically possible. The Americans had simply refused to accept those limitations, throwing industrial might at the problem until it disappeared. Where German staff officers saw mathematical impossibilities, American logistics officers saw challenges to overcome with more trucks, more drivers, and more determination. The Red Ball Express had not just supplied an army, it had shattered an entire military philosophy, proving that in the age of industrial warfare there were no limits except those imposed by imagination and will. The drivers of the Red Ball Express had written their names into history, not with bullets, but with tyre tracks across the face of France, an indelible mark that stretched from the beaches of Normandy to the borders of Germany, testament to what American industrial might and human determination could achieve when combined in common purpose. They had proven that modern wars would not be won by the generals who best understood tactics, but by the nations that could best transform their industrial capacity into military power, delivering overwhelming material to the point of decision faster than any enemy could respond. The transformation was complete. In August 1944, German generals had dismissed the idea that trucks could replace trains in strategic military logistics. By November, those same generals were either dead, captured, or in retreat, their armies starved of supplies, while the Americans advanced with seemingly unlimited resources. The Red Ball Express had not just supplied Patton's army. It had demonstrated a new reality of warfare that would define military conflict for generations to come. German generals had stopped laughing. They had witnessed something that their military science said was impossible, an army advancing 600 miles from its bases, supplied entirely by trucks, never pausing, never culminating, never running out of anything. They had seen the future of warfare, and it belonged to the nation that could produce the most trucks and train the most drivers to keep them rolling 24 hours a day. In conference rooms in Berlin, German staff officers tried desperately to understand what had happened. How had the Americans sustained an advance that every calculation showed was impossible? The answer was simple and devastating. The Americans had not accepted the constraints that limited other armies. They had simply produced more trucks, trained more drivers, and organized them with an efficiency that turned logistics from a military necessity into a strategic weapon. As the war moved into Germany itself in 1945, the lessons of the Red Ball Express became even clearer. American forces advanced not because they were better fighters than the Germans. Many would argue the Wehrmacht remained tactically superior until the end, but because they never ran out of supplies. Every American unit had more ammunition than it could shoot, more fuel than it could burn, more food than it could eat. The logistics system that the Red Ball Express had pioneered ensured that American firepower could be brought to bear continuously, overwhelmingly, decisively. German soldiers captured in the final months of the war told consistent stories. They had run out of ammunition while the Americans seemed to have unlimited supplies. They had run out of fuel while American tanks kept advancing. They had run out of food while American soldiers threw away rations they didn't like. The material superiority was so overwhelming that tactical excellence became irrelevant. What did it matter if German soldiers were better trained when American soldiers had 10 times the ammunition? The Red Ball Express had proven something that military theorists would study for decades. In modern industrial warfare, logistics is not just a support function, but the decisive factor. The side that can deliver the most material to the point of contact will win, regardless of tactical disadvantages. The Americans had understood this truth and built their entire war effort around it. The Germans, still thinking in terms of operational art and tactical excellence, had never grasped it until too late. After the war, German military professionals would study the Red Ball Express as a masterclass in logistics. At the new German Staff College, American logistics methods became required study. Former Wehrmacht officers, now training the new West German Army, would emphasize again and again the lesson of 1944. Wars are won not on the battlefield, but in the supply depot, not by the general who can maneuver best, but by the one who never runs out of fuel. The drivers themselves, the men who had made it all possible, returned to an America that still treated them as second-class citizens. Despite their crucial role in winning the war, African American veterans faced discrimination, segregation, and violence. Many of the men who had driven the trucks that defeated Nazi Germany couldn't get jobs driving trucks in America. The irony was bitter, but the achievement remained. In military history courses around the world, the Red Ball Express became a case study in how to win wars through logistics. The numbers alone told the story. 23,000 drivers, 83 days, 412,000 tons of supplies, victory. But behind those numbers was a human story of determination, ingenuity, and courage that transformed modern warfare. The legacy of the Red Ball Express extended far beyond World War II. In Korea, in Vietnam, in every American military operation since, the lessons learned on the roads of France in 1944 have been applied. Logistics is not just important, it is decisive. The army that can keep its forces supplied will defeat the army that cannot, regardless of any other factors. The transformation that began on August 25, 1944, when the first Red Ball Express trucks rolled out of St. Lo, had changed warfare forever. German military leaders who had dismissed American trucks as inferior to their railway-based logistics system had witnessed the birth of a new kind of warfare, one where industrial capacity and organizational efficiency mattered more than all the military traditions and tactical excellence in the world. In the end, the Red Ball Express was more than just a supply operation. It was a demonstration of American industrial might, organizational capability, and human determination that shattered every assumption about what was possible in warfare. The secret army that fueled Patton's Blitz had never been secret at all. It had operated in plain sight, its trucks thundering across France in endless convoys that German forces could see but couldn't stop. The psychological impact had been as devastating as the material effect. How do you maintain morale when the enemy has so many trucks they don't even bother to hide them? How do you plan operations when the enemy ignores the constraints that bind your own forces? These were the questions German commanders asked themselves as they watched the Red Ball Express transform warfare before their eyes. They had no answers because they were trying to fight a new kind of war with old ideas. The Americans had not just outproduced them, they had outthought them, recognizing that in modern industrial warfare, the side that could deliver the most material to the battlefield would win. The Red Ball Express had proven this truth beyond any doubt. In 83 days, it had delivered victory. German military leaders had learned too late that in modern warfare, logistics is strategy, supply is tactics, and the nation with the most trucks will defeat the nation with the best soldiers. It was not the war they had trained for, but it was the war they had to fight, and they had lost it on the roads of France, where American trucks had rolled day and night, unstoppable and overwhelming. The transformation was complete. Modern warfare had been forever changed by 23,000 drivers, most of them African Americans, who had proven that in industrial age, conflict the truck was mightier than the tank, logistics more important than tactics, and determination to keep rolling more decisive than any battlefield maneuver. The German generals who had laughed at American trucks in August 1944 had witnessed the birth of a new age of warfare, and they had been on the wrong side of history.